When I started making the script for this video, I expected GW guard numbers to make absolutely no sense. But what I found out through research and calculations is that they make more sense than you might originally think. Not due to any lack of manpower, but simply due to one specific bottleneck that we shall talk about at the end of the video. In today's video, we shall discuss how many men can an average high world recruit, how many supplies would that force require annually, and finally, how much money would it cost to form and equip such a formation each and every year. But first, we have to discuss how many men can an average Imperial world raise for war. Again, for this scenario, we shall be picking a hive world, since they are the worlds from which the majority of the foot soldiers come from. Now, on an average hive world, there can be anywhere from 5 all the way up to 20 hive cities on the planet. In this scenario, we shall be picking the middle of the road, aka 10 hive cities. Next up, we have to calculate what's an average population of a singular hive city. This again is also a range. It goes anywhere from 10 all the way up to 100 billion. We shall be picking the average, which is 50 billion per hive city. That would mean that an average hive planet has a population of approximately 500 billion people. Now we have to calculate a natality, mortality, and an average birth rate. Average age in the Imperium is 60 years. Since hive worlds are much worse than average worlds in the Imperium, we shall assume that it's 40 years in the hive cities. We shall also say that an average birth rate is 8 kids per woman, since contraceptives are quite rare in the Imperium and especially in the Underhive. But even this birth rate is pushing it, since it would mean that a woman would be pregnant and extremely vulnerable a quarter of her life, not to mention probable labor mortality rate from unsanitary conditions. I'll discuss this more in the future video about why hive cities don't make any sense. Subscribe and like the video if you want to see that one. Due to all of this, we shall say that only half of the kids will ever reach 18, so we shall be assuming that each woman will have 4 surviving kids, 2 men and 2 women. This is not super accurate, since when men are under a lot of stress, they tend to produce a lot more C women than C men, but I can't be bothered calculating 2.4 women to 1.6 men, so 2 on 2 it is. We shall be conscripting 1 out of every 2 men into the guard. Why not women, you might ask? Well, it's because if we conscripted them, then we would have a shrinking hive population, since obviously some women would die in the childbirth and gang violence constantly going on in the Underhive. Also, biologically speaking, men are way more disposable, since you only need 1 man per 100 women, but it doesn't work in the reverse since biology. Plus, if the women are in the guard, then you would have to worry about them being pregnant, having periods and hormonal issues that come with that, which would all require extra supplies to mitigate. You could solve the pregnancy issue with either sterilizing them or giving them birth control, which would be incredibly expensive, or simply putting them into their own segregated regiments, which would be its own issue, since then they couldn't fight with other non-segregated regiments, again for the fear of them getting knocked up, nor could they receive male officers that are not sterilized from other formations or interact with the local civil population for the same reasons. Okay, I'm getting carried away from the point of the video, let's get back to the numbers. So calculating previous points together, we get this. Each year there will be 12.5 billion births per year. 6.25 billion will be men. 50% will be conscripted, which will give us 3.125 billion new recruits. Let's deduct 125 million, since PDF, Arbites and other paramilitary forces would also require manpower, meaning high worlds produce 3 billion men each and every year for the galactic meat grinder, approximately 1/3 of the today's Earth's population. Now, before I get any comments saying that that's wrong, since Germany in the World War II managed to conscript nearly 20% of its overall population, and many other nations achieved similar numbers, the reason for this is that Germany expected those men to return home. They were supposed to go out, fight, win and return home to work and have families. Once hive worlds send out their young men to the guard, they are crossed from the population census, since everyone knows that they are never coming back. Alongside that, many Germans in World War II were captured and returned to Germany after the war. Same shit doesn't happen in the galaxy of 40k. You are better off blowing your brains out than getting captured by any 40k faction outside of maybe the Tau. But even then, crew recruits aren't known for taking good care of their prisoners. So yeah, that's the reason why they can't really do that. Okay, with that said, let's cover the most important section of every military, that being the logistics. After all, military marches on its stomach, and if your troops can't get food, water, clothes and other equipment, the army is as good as useless. So, in World War II, in the European theater of the war, USA had roughly 3 soldiers in non-combat roles like truck drivers, medics, cook, mechanics and many others for each man that they had fighting on the front lines. Now, this is somewhat misleading since they also hired a lot of French and British private contractors to help out as well, which simply weren't recorded in the official figures. In the Pacific, however, where they didn't have such luxuries, tooth to tail ratio was 15 logi personnel for every 1 combat soldier. In Vietnam it was 13 to 1, and even in Afghanistan/Iraq, with all their automation and reliance on private contractors, it was still 8 to 1. Now in 40k I think Pacific ratio is the most probable, since offloading cargo from spaceships is much more difficult than offloading cargo from Liberty ships. Okay, so you may say, what about servitors? Surely they can help out with this. Yes and no. They could do that, but they would require their own logistical tail with all their spare parts, new organs, periodic software updates, as well as requiring extra food, water and fuel. Plus, it's just inefficient. If you have 3 billion men with 15 to 1 ratio, that would mean that you would have 200 million combat troops and 2.8 billion logi personnel. Logi personnel can perform servitor jobs until combat section sustains heavy casualties, then logi section can transfer replacements to the combat one. With that said, logi section is done, let's move on to the food. Average person eats about 1.5 kilograms per day. 1.5 kilograms per day times 365 days per year equals 547.5 kilograms per year. So basically an average person consumes roughly 0.55 tons of food per year. So for 3 billion strong army, that's 1.65 billion metric tons of food. Now I know that some people are gonna mention algae farms that the Kriegsmen used on wrecks, but I believe that those were implied to only be used by a Kriegsman, since they don't suffer from the morale loss caused by eating the same food over and over again. Plus, it also requires a lot of infrastructure to set up, which all requires time, which Kriegsmen only had because they were sieging the city and expecting a prolonged engagement. Okay, next let's get to artillery. Kriegsmen on wrecks had roughly 2,500 guns and mortars of various calibers per 100,000 men. In comparison, USA only has 640 guns per 100,000 men if we are not including small caliber mortars. Now, this is not really a good comparison or even a stat to use for this video, since the 88 was a siege army, so they had way more artillery systems than average, but I can't be bothered to look for better numbers. If you have them, post them down in the comments below. So if we have 2,500 guns per 100,000 men, then for 200 million men you will have 5 million artillery guns. Now 40k calibers are all over the place, but their main artillery caliber used by Basilisk is comparable to IRL 155mm. There are of course larger and smaller calibers, but we shall be using 155 as a benchmark. M777 can fire roughly 2,500 shells before requiring barrel replacements. If we assume that the Basilisk is comparable to M777, and if we also assume that the guard would take 5 spare barrels with them, then that would mean that each artillery gun could fire approximately 12,500 artillery shells. Average 155mm shell used by M777 weighs roughly around 43 kilograms, but for the sake of ease of math we shall put it at 40 kilograms. So one artillery gun can fire 12,500 shells during its lifetime, which is equivalent to 500,000 kilograms in weight or 500 tons. So 5 million guns would require 2,500,000,000 tons of shells as well as 40 million combat troops to operate. Of course, going with the assumption of 8 crew per 1 gun, which I think is fair due to Imperium's lack of mechanical loading assists on their artillery systems. Okay, next up are the fuel, trucks and AFVs. Let's first cover the trucks. From my research, I couldn't find any regular trucks being used by the Imperial Guard. The closest closest thing I could find is the Goliath truck, but that thing is built more like an APC than any logistical vehicle. It's far too heavy and thus consumes far too much fuel to be used effectively as a supply transport. So I'm just gonna go with the assumption that the Imperium has some random STC about a regular World War II or Cold War era softskin truck. Now, in World War II, US had 2.5 million trucks for 16 million men. That's the ratio of one truck for 6.4 men. So you would need roughly 31,250,000 trucks for 200 million combat troops. Let's round that to 30 million since it's easier on the math. You would also need anywhere from 30 all the way up to 120 million drivers, but these would come from the Logi branch, so they aren't gonna get deducted from the combat troops. The Logi branch itself would also require another 30 million trucks and their respective crews, since the logistical personnel also require food, water and building materials. Going on with the assumption that each truck weighs roughly around 5 tons, since Imperium builds them with some super duper lightweight but still mega strong material, we get that 60 million trucks would weigh approximately 300 million tons. Plus they would also need another 300 million tons in spare parts like spare tires, engines, transmissions, engine oils and so on. Now I know that some people will say that 60 million trucks is simply not enough, which is kind of true, but the Guard would also rely on pre-existing rail and pipeline infrastructure present on the planet. And if there are none, then they would simply build their own, which would alleviate the pressure from the trucks, since they would just have to transport the supplies from the railway stations instead of transporting them from the planetary dockyards or FOBs. Okay, next up is the armor or APCs. For the ease of math, we shall be assuming that each vehicle is a Lehman Russ, even though there are many others like the Chimera. But for the most part, they all share a similar chassis, so divergences will be minimal. So on Vrax, Krieg had roughly 900,000 men in the armor, which was roughly a quarter of the overall force. Assuming that 400,000 are vehicle crewmen and the other 500,000 are mechanized infantry, and also assuming average crew of 4 crewmen per vehicle, that's 100,000 AFVs. For us, with 200 million, that's 50 million men going to the armor regiments, which is 5,555,555 AFVs. With an average weight of 50 tons per vehicle, that's 280 million tons altogether. Also, for spare parts like barrels, tracks, engines, armor plates and so on, let's add another 320 million tons. Now, tank barrels of 120mm caliber, if they are smoothbore, can usually sustain 2000 tank shells before they need barrel replacements. Because Lehman Russ is one of those tanks that uses 120mm smoothbore cannon, these figures should be broadly correct. If you want to know as to why Russ having a smoothbore may not be the best barrel type for such a vehicle, go watch my video about the Lehman Russ and why it's irreplaceable. Anyways, assuming 5 spare barrels, that's 10k shells per tank. Average tank shell weighs roughly 20 kilograms or 0.02 tons. That's 55 billion shells times 0.02 tons, which equals to 1,100,000,000 tons. Now again, this is not fully accurate since some APCs use small arms and others use las weapons, which are rechargeable using las packs. But for the sake of simplicity, it shall stay like this. Next up is oil. I can already feel the freedom flowing through me. Just saying that word makes me want to bomb brown people in the third world. Okay, unfunny jokes aside, M113, which is the closest looking chassis to 40k vehicles, will travel roughly 10,000 kilometers in its lifetime. Aside from that, it consumes roughly 0.8 liters of fuel per kilometer. We shall be using these stats for 40k APCs in spite of us weighing 60 tons and M113 only weighing 13 tons. Without armor add-ons, of course. Yeah, I don't know why I did this, and it's too late to fix it, so chalk it up to some Mechanicus fuel magic, I guess. Regardless, with 5,555,555 AFVs, the armored branch would require 44,444,440,000 liters of fuel, or 38 million metric tons of fuel annually. Next up, trucks. They can travel 50,000 kilometers, per lifetime. Their fuel economy varies, but 0.5 liters per kilometer fully loaded with supplies seems fair. So with 60 million trucks, that's 1.5 trillion liters of fuel, or 1,275,000,000 metric tons. So for comparison to IRL, global oil consumption is approximately 5 billion metric tons per year. Together, armor and trucks of a singular Guards Hive army with conservative estimates consume roughly 1,313,250,000 tons of fuel, or 1 to 2/5 of the overall Earth's annual consumption. Now, let's cover the approximate cost of equipping the army. Let's cover minimal kit that each guardsman and logistical personnel would require and assume their cost using IRL alternatives. Lasgun 2k, uniform 1k, helmet plus armor 2k, sleeping bag 1k, entrenching tools 1k, first aid plus bayonet 1k, gas mask, which everyone uses, not only Krieg, would also be 1k, canteen plus spare las packs is also another 1k. Overall, that's 10k per soldier. Now, assuming that guardsmen would also require twice as many spares in case something breaks, that's another 20k per soldier. If you think that this might not be required, I want to remind you that French soldiers in World War I stuck bayonets in each other's barrels for fun, which caused them to get stuck and requiring a gunsmith to fix. The problem became so bad that they had to change the entire manufacturing process of the equipment to stop this from happening. I have no doubt that people in 40k are just as dumb as those in 1914, especially since most of the guardsmen would be 18 or 19 years old. So altogether that would be $60 trillion dues for 3 billion men. Next up are AFVs. With an average cost of $100,000 dues per unit, that would be $555 billion overall. Now, this is kind of misleading since Imperium is a quasi-communist state with wartime economy. So prices kind of don't exist, and more important factors are resource availability and man hours needed for construction. Next up are trucks. Number 60 million. Cost per unit 60,000. Overall, that's $3,600 billion dues. After that, we have food. I just want to say that in a realistic scenario, food would be varied, but for the simplicity's sake, we shall pick rice as the only food they brought. The cost of rice is $300 per 1 ton. We need 1.65 billion metric tons of rice, so the overall cost will be $495 billion. After that, we have the god of war, the artillery. Okay, I can already sense that most of you are getting bored, so I'm just gonna skip to the final figures. For artillery, it is 10 trillion overall. Next, for the oil section, it will be $1.885 trillion overall. Next up, for ammo. For 155mm shells, we will need $312 trillion. Now, as for 120mm shells, we are gonna need $555 trillion. So the overall total for the ammo will come at $860 trillion. And then finally, for extra supplies like medical supplies and construction equipment like pipes for human wastage, concrete for bunkers, and then others like paper, tents, sandbags, water tanks, field kitchens, and so much more, the total for those extra supplies will come at 100 trillion, and the weight for all of them will be 1 billion. Now let's calculate pure total money, which is $176 trillion. For reference, US debt stands at 37 trillion, and the global GDP is equal to 114 trillion. Now, as for pure total weight, using an average weight of 80 kilograms per person, 3 billion people would weigh approximately 240 billion kilograms, or 240 million metric tons. So combining that and previous numbers, we get a pure total weight of 9 billion tons. But let's shave 500 million tons of that because Administrata managed to find, I don't know, some corpse starch shipments, thus alleviating the guards' nutritional needs. Yes, totally that, and not because I screwed up the numbers and can't be bothered recalculating the next section of the video. Okay, so how many ships would be needed for transport? Well, Universe class mass convoy, the largest and most expensive transport ship Imperium has to offer, has these specs. Dimensions: 12 kilometers long, 1.3 kilometers wide. Mass is approximately 60 megatons, and it it can carry approximately half of that in cargo, so approximately 30 million tons of cargo. Crew is around 60,000, and fully unloaded I believe it can carry 500,000 passengers. Keep in mind that these ships are extremely rare and ludicrously expensive for Imperium to produce. They are either the same size or slightly larger than even the Emperor class battleships that are 8 to 12 kilometers long. So 3 billion men divided by 500,000 troop capacity means you would need 6,000 of these ships for all the guardsmen alone. You would also add 360 million voidsmen, which would require their own supplies like food, water, medical supplies, ammo, and so much more. For comparison, average 40k battle fleet has around 70 to 80 capital ships and 3 to 4,000 combat support ships. And remember, all 6,000 of your transport ships are 12 kilometers long, which is larger than most capital ships and dwarfs 2 to 3 kilometer long support ships. Now, as for cargo, 8,503,000,000 tons divided by 30 million ton capacity of the UCMC ships, you would need an extra 284 ships, which isn't too bad, but again, I can't stress enough how rare these ships are. Imperium probably has only around 50k or so of these ships, if even that. Also keep in mind that out of billions of transport ships that Imperium operates, only a handful can go through the warp. Most of them are slower than the speed of light and require generations to reach their locations, which for the Imperial Guard purposes renders them completely and utterly useless. But Imperium also operates smaller ships like the Vanguard class merchant trader and the Karak class transport ships. Dimensions are 2 kilometers long, 0.4 kilometers wide. Mass approximately 8 megatons, can carry 4 million tons or so and 83,000 troops. Crew is around 18,000 men. For guardsmen alone you would require 36,145 ships, which would be the fleet 10 times the size of a regular Imperial battle fleet. You would also need 650,610,000 extra voidsmen. As for cargo, it's 8,503,000,000 divided by 4 million, which equals to 2,126 ships. So I think that now it's pretty obvious where the bottleneck is and why Imperium deploys guard regiments numbering 1 million men strong instead of 1 billion men strong. There's simply not enough void capable craft to transport all these men. Imperium ain't dedicating 1/5 of their best troop transports to a singular hive world. They would much rather just take the 1 million of the best troops that hive world has to offer and use those to train the local PDF that are defending their planet, alongside using them as either a breakthrough or a fire brigade force. Also, you have seen how it's much more efficient to just transport the material instead of the troops. So realistically, it's far better to just transfer the material to the world in need and make the guard form new guard regiments with locally available manpower. But what if we did have 200 million combat men fighting on the world the size of Earth? Let's say that guard control half of the planet and the hostile force controls the other half. Circumference of the Earth is roughly 40,075 kilometers. 500 men per 1 kilometer is considered a strong line. 250 men per kilometer is considered an average line. Less than 200 men is considered a weak line. So a strong continuous line across all of the world would require roughly 20 million men. There are 50 million men in armor, there are 40 million in artillery, which leaves 110 million in infantry. So you could have 5 infantry lines. 20 million in first frontline trench, another 20 million in the second defense and counter-attack line, then another 20 million in the third fallback line, then again another 20 million in the fourth reserve line, and finally another 30 million in the fifth reorganization, re-equipping and regrouping line, where infantry regiments get sent once they sustain heavy casualties and need replenishing. Armor would be spread across the world as either a breakthrough or a quick response force. And then finally artillery would get amassed for preliminary bombardments on the attack or just to serve as an anti-infantry force on the defensive. Okay, that would be it. If you like this video, remember to smash the like button, comment down below if you agree or believe that I made a mistake somewhere. Until the next time, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.